Hello, I'm Marcel Weeder, host of The Point. Over the past several months, 6 candidates have been vying for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party. In this episode, we present all 6 of them in their own words. Brenda, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Brenda, I'll start off with, give us a little bit about your background, history, because honestly, a lot of Ontario Liberals and the public at large aren't familiar with you.
Right. I'm a bit of a mystery. I grew up in Ottawa, so that's where I'm from, and lived there for most of my life until I went off to university. I went to Queen's for undergrad, and then I have a master's from Ottawa U and also a law degree from Ottawa U. Then I moved to Toronto, where I practiced at a Bay Street firm for a few years and then a smaller boutique firm. In that time, also had 2 kids, and my husband and I, my husband's also a lawyer, we decided to move back to Ottawa. And that's where we've been since. So about 16 years back in Ottawa.
And when you went to university, so you were at Queen's for your undergrad.
Yes.
Were you involved in politics and student government or in party politics?
I was a big debater, actually. So my focus in university was the debating union. So there was a lot of overlap with the political scene, but for me, debating in the purest form was my passion. And so I went to all sorts of inter-university tournaments, and I actually went to the World Championships in Glasgow, and Queen sent me to the Ukraine. I know you're not supposed to say the Ukraine. I went to Ukraine for a debating tournament too. So I had a great career as a debater.
Oh, it stands you well as a lawyer to be a debater.
Yes, yep, and it's helped in this process too.
Mm-hmm. And you went and did a master's at the University of Ottawa. In what area?
English literature. So my undergrad and my master's were both in English. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
But no history of politics, because I think you were at the Empire Club and you mentioned that you actually did have a little bit of background in party politics.
Well, sure. I was always a Liberal supporter, and so from a very young age did canvassing with my parents when they would go out, always for Liberal candidates, sometimes for municipal too. And then when I was older, I canvassed in my own right for our local candidate, always the Liberal candidate as well. And then in 2007, my very close friend ran for the Liberals in Dufferin-Caledon, and so that re-sparked my interest.
Elizabeth Hall.
That's right,
who was the candidate there.
That's right. So I worked on her blog, did some of her communications, and remotely, and that was sort of the beginning of being able to work remotely on a campaign. But I did that, and that sort of re-sparked my interest, and been interested since again.
So unlike some of the candidates, you haven't held any political office.
No, I haven't run for anything.
Mm-hmm. So if you're going to run, go for the top of the ticket.
Well, I'm not 25 years old. I've run a growing business. I've done a lot of leadership things in my life. I've held a lot of important roles. So it didn't seem to be the stretch that it may seem to someone, who doesn't know anything about what I've done in my past.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of your life experience, you are currently a lawyer, obviously.
Yes.
Are there any activities that you've been involved in charitable or social organizations?
Yeah, so in terms of charitable, I am always involved in things going on in the community. One of the big examples that was something I did outside my law firm was I participated in a program called Mother Love, which was a bunch of women in Ottawa who got together to support a northern Indigenous community where children were suffering. There were a string of suicides, and we wanted to get involved. So each woman took on a different role. I was responsible for sports. At that time, I had two very active athletes, so I was very interested in helping. I knew how good that was for teenagers. So I raised a pile of money, and I also collected a bunch of new sporting equipment, like a lot of new sporting equipment that we were able to give to that community. And the kids ended up with, I forget the number, but a very large number of skateboards, skateboard helmets, and
safety first.
Personal injury lawyer. And so that was a bit of a bone of contention that we spent the money on helmets, but I wasn't having it any other way because somebody years ago had built them a skateboard park up there, but nobody had any skateboards. So that was an example of a really great event, and we brought leaders from their community, including youth leaders, down to Ottawa, and we had a big dinner for them and presented them with the goods and the money, and it was really an excellent event.
So, Michael, for those people who don't know your background, do you want to share a little bit about who you are, where you came from?
Yeah, so I arrived in Canada when I was about 4.5. My brother, my mother and father, the four of us were here. My parents actually came a little bit earlier than us. I stayed with my uncle and my aunt, and about a year later we arrived from England. I was born in Huddersfield in northern Yorkshire in England.
And you have no accent.
No, they got teased out of me at an early age by the other kids. But my father was about 18 years old, left Grenada. He was a tailor, went to England and met my mother, and they started a family, came here, grew up in Flemington Park, which is at Don Mills in Eglinton, not too far from where we are right now, right across from the Science Centre, and grew up there from about 4.5 to the time I went to university. Went to Carleton, graduated with a political science degree and a Canadian history degree. Then I traveled, worked in South Korea for 2.5 years, and then came back, decided to run for the school board, and that was 16 years ago. So I've gone through 6 elections, half of those as a school board trustee and half as an MPP. I've won 6 elections, been elected for 16 years. And the last election, I actually went against the deputy mayor of Toronto, and of course, probably the most challenging election in my life last June, and we came out with about 1,000 votes, 1,000 vote victory. And I'm very happy to be in the legislature. Now I'm the critic for several different things, mostly around economic development and trade. But I have served as the Minister for Citizenship and Immigration, Tourism, Culture and Sport, Children and Youth Services, Community Social Services, Anti-Racism, and the Pan Am Games. When I grew up, the neighborhood was a lot different than it is today. There was a lot of youth violence, a lot of economic challenges, and there's still some economic challenges and violence. But as a community growing up, where we saw a lot of young people pass away from violent crime. Probably a dozen young men I knew from the neighborhood who passed away, and I remember once saying in the Toronto Star that I knew more young men in my age cohort that passed away from gun violence than actually went off to university, and that was during the debate around the Afrocentric school and the race-based data at the Toronto District School Board, if you remember. But the neighborhood was, it had its challenges, but it also had some really cool benefits. Living in a neighborhood like that. Every single person from around the world was in Flemington Park. It was so multicultural. In my hallway alone, there were people from the Dela Cruzes from the Philippines. There were people from Korea, from parts of Africa, from the Caribbean, Yugoslavian, Dutch. Every single nationality was in that hallway.
It's like the UN.
Yeah, and at 6 o'clock when people started to cook, it was like the smell of all different spices. It was like the UN of spices. It was just incredible to grow up in that type of environment. So I learned how to adapt to different cultures quickly, and I just think it was one of the best places to grow up. From that, I went to the library in Flemington Park, figured out the difference between a liberal, conservative, NDP. I read about the Rhino Party, all these different parties. I decided I was a liberal, and went down to 10 St. Mary's, which is the headquarters, as you know, for the Liberal Party. And I walked in. The first liberal I ever met was Guy Bethel. Right. And I said I wanted to volunteer. I was about 16, 17, and he put me to work. I sorted memberships the whole summer, and that was my entry point into just politics in general.
So, Stephen, share with us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, what you were active in. I think people know you as a politician, but right. There's more to you besides that.
Well, there is. I mean, you mentioned my legislative career, and you're quite right. For just about 6 years, I served as the MPP for Vaughan. The last 4 years that we were in power, I had the honor of serving as a cabinet minister. I've actually been very active in Liberal Party politics for a long period of time. And don't worry, I'll discuss my non-political activities as well in just a quick second. But I was 15 years of age when I first got brought into Liberal Party politics, and I turned 46 last year, so 31 consecutive years. In fact, somebody pointed out to me on the campaign trail that I've spent about 75% of my time on this planet as an active Liberal, and I'm proud of that. But I've lived now in Vaughan for about 30 years, give or take, first in Kleinburg, and now my wife and I are raising our young daughters in Woodbridge. And prior to moving to Vaughan, we lived in Etobicoke. I was born in Etobicoke. I lived there till I was about 14 or so years of age, 14 or 15, and then we moved up to Vaughan. So yeah, like I'm a GTA guy. I'm proud of the incredible province we have, and I love every single region. But I'm born and raised here in the GTA.
And your parents came to Canada in the late 50s?
My dad came from Italy in 1958 when he was 20, and my mom came from Scotland in 1961 when she was also 20, which means I've just accidentally told the world how old my mom is, so hope nobody tells her that I've done that. I don't want to get in trouble, but it's true. My parents came from Italy and Scotland, respectively.
Mm-hmm. And they met, obviously, in Toronto, and they ended up moving to Etobicoke and raising you?
No, actually, it's they met in 1961, not that many months after my mom arrived at a community dance on a Sunday afternoon.
It's very similar to my parents, how they met. Okay.
They started to date. Obviously, they courted. They fell in love. They decided to get married. They got married in 1964, July 1964, at St. Peter's Church, which is near the corner of Bathurst and Bloor. And shortly after getting married, they decided that they were going to move to Scotland.
Oh.
So late in 64, they moved back, for my mom, back to Scotland, where all of her family was. So when my mom came here at the age of 20, she was the only member of her family who was here, who was coming here and was here. And so in 1964, 65, they moved back to Scotland. They stayed there until 71. So my older sister and older brother were actually both born in Glasgow, Scotland. My parents came back in 71, first stayed with my dad's parents in the Keele and Eglinton area, and then bought the house that I was born into in Etobicoke, and I was the first one of our family born here in Canada.
And so from high school, you went where for university?
I did first year of university at Carleton in 1992. That's when I started at Carleton. After first year, I decided to transfer back to Toronto, back to the GTA, and I went to the University of Toronto. I studied political science and history, and continued to be very, very active in politics, and kind of immersed myself pretty deeply in the politics of the GTA at all levels, municipal, provincial, and federal. And then many, many years later, when I was 30, I decided to pursue law, and I went to Osgoode Hall Law School and graduated from there in 2007, I believe, just a little bit older at that point in time. And in between the two academic experiences, I worked inside government at Queen's Park, but also for a couple of different federal cabinet ministers.
So you were primarily in Toronto. as opposed to going up to Ottawa to work, or did you?
I never worked in Ottawa, but when I worked for both Maria Mina first and then Joe Volpe later on.
Right.
They were both Toronto ministers in Chrétien and then Paul Martin's governments, and the minister's regional office, which is a bit of a hub for ministerial activity in downtown Toronto, is where I was stationed for both of them. And so that was the experience I had. I went to Ottawa frequently on their behalf or at their request, but I was physically based here in the GTA.
So, Kate, let's start off by giving us a little bit about your background.
Sure.
A lot of people have heard your name, but don't know about your background, other than you're a professor and a former candidate for the Liberals in the 2018 election.
Sure, I can fill in some of the details. So I grew up in Exeter. It's a small town in southwestern Ontario, about 3,500 people when I was living there. My parents were both teachers. My dad was the elementary school principal of the school that I went to, so you can imagine I didn't get away with a lot as a kid. And we lived there till I was kind of midway through high school, and so very familiar with small town life in Ontario. We moved to high school because my dad started teaching at Western. And so I've stayed in London ever since for about the last 20 years. I did my undergraduate and master's degree at Western, and then started working for the City of London as a public servant. And I spent 10 years there. When I left, I was a director doing culture, government relations, and economic development. I loved my job, but there were a couple of issues where we needed more help from Queen's Park. So in 2017, I left my job and decided to start on this political adventure. I ran as a candidate in 2018, and of course, what turned out to be the toughest election in our history, and very much a part of the motivation that leads me here today.
And you currently teach at the University of Western Ontario, and
Yes.
you're teaching politics.
Yeah, so I did, during the time when I worked at the city, I did my PhD also at Western and started teaching a bit, and then after the election have been teaching on a more full-time basis since. Yeah.
Any particular focus in the teaching?
Mostly local government. My dissertation research was all on the leadership of cities. How do political leaders motivate a community? How do they mobilize people? And so I teach a lot about local government leadership, and then more recently some women in politics courses as well.
Now, just picking up on that, you did a series of podcasts
I did.
interviewing female prime ministers and premiers.
Yes. So we've only had 12 women, now 13, with Carolyn Cochrane in the Northwest
That's
Territories. But at the time, it was just 12 women in all of history who've served as a First Minister. And so together with Canada 2020, I had the opportunity to go to their homes and sit down and do very in-depth interviews. And we pulled it together as a podcast called No Second Chances, which did really well and talks about the challenges that women face in seeking our highest political roles and really exploring the big question about why don't we see women being reelected in Canada.
Mitzi Hunter, so tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah. So, I'm that unlikely story. I immigrated to Canada as a small child, and my parents worked very hard. My dad, he was in construction. He drove a truck, and eventually he owned a few of them. And so he was a small business owner. And my mom, she worked in assembly for the auto parts manufacturing that was booming at the time. And this was in the mid 70s. So, those are the memories that I have of growing up. We would always meet for dinner every night and talk about our day as a family. And of course, you have an opportunity to dream. And my parents used to say, you're in this country to have a better life. And that's why we made that journey to come here. And for me, that was through the door of education.
And did you get involved as a young person? Were you involved in the political process?
I was actually more involved in advocacy as a youth. In high school, I went to Winston Churchill Collegiate in Scarborough, and I became the student council president. And so I had the opportunity to represent the school, to speak on behalf of students, and to bring people together. So that's what I was always doing as a teenager and as a young adult is how do I get involved in improving my school or improving my community? Later, I went to the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, of course.
I went to Scarborough campus too.
I worked to put myself through school. So I was always working while studying. So it took me a little longer to finish my undergrad degree. And then once I had finished, I then went back and did my master's degree at Rotman. I did an MBA.
And from there, some people noticed your activism and your history and persuaded you to seek an elected position in a by-election to replace Margaret Best, who retired in Scarborough-Gilwood.
Yes. So while I was leading civic action and actually working on an initiative called What Would You Do with 32? We were looking at how to create revenue tools to fund the investment in public transit. And that campaign was something that I worked on and led on behalf of the organization and was getting very successful traction and results. When we had a new premier appointed, Kathleen Wynne, to lead the Liberal Party and the province, and I got the call from the party to run in a by-election in Scarborough, where I had grown up and lived, worked, and really just love my community. I said yes. I said I would stand as a candidate in this riding, and I jumped in. I won the by-election.
Yes,
and immediately took on a number of different portfolios. I was appointed to be parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Community and Social Services, the Honourable Ted McMeekin, who was such a fantastic person to work with and to learn from. I worked on a select committee for developmental disabilities and dual diagnoses. And that was something that was very close to me because I had worked at Goodwill for 7 years, and I know the families and people who are born with disabilities who need that support over a lifetime. And how do we provide that support in this province? And so it was an incredible time to get into politics and to get into government. Within a year of winning the by-election, the general election was called in 2014.
You got to repeat it all over again.
I got to repeat it all over again. I had to knock on all the doors again. And
but this time they knew who you were.
Yes, this time they knew who I was, Marcel, and I won my riding the second time by 50%.
So Alvin, let's talk first about your background. Give me a little bit of a snapshot of who you are, where you came from.
So I live in Mississauga. I'm there with my wife, who's been a nurse for over 12 years, and we've got 3 kids. 2 boys and a girl. It goes boy, girl, boy. They're 9 years old is the oldest, 7-year-old is my daughter, and I have a 5-year-old son who's in
a young family.
Yeah, very young family.
And where did you grow up?
I also grew up in Mississauga. My parents were immigrants in the late 70s. They came from Indonesia. They're ethnic Chinese Indonesian. And so we were just celebrating Chinese New Year over the weekend. As well, when I was growing up, I was always curious. I was always interested in politics. We're on the Mayor's Youth Advisory Committee, things like that. I was the Young Citizen of the Year in Mississauga years ago because I was involved and interested in seeing what was happening and understanding and realizing that in order to change things for the better, you have to be involved and you have to know what's going on. So I asked my parents, who did they support and why did they support them? And my mom always gave me this interesting answer where she talked about how she voted Liberal because when she immigrated to Canada, Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister, and that the programs that the government had to integrate new immigrants were just phenomenal, right? People were taught how to speak English. They had placement programs for employment. They helped people get an education, and that they accepted them as Canadian, even though they just immigrated there, right? And sort of that spirit. And I'm not saying that conservatives don't share some of that, but I think, my parents felt that it was a uniquely liberal brand in terms of welcoming people and understanding that we're stronger when we embrace our diversity. So I thought about that, and I agreed with with that sentiment, and I joined the Young Liberals when I was a teenager. Wasn't overly involved, but I participated, went to a couple of meetings, and continued being involved throughout university. And then afterwards, I started working for some advocacy organizations. I worked for the student government when I was in university, and then after I graduated, worked for the umbrella student organization across Ontario, the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance. And understanding that working with government, with educated solutions to try and provide actual solutions and not just criticisms of what government does is incredibly important. To be a partner of the government and to work with the government to say, these are the challenges that students face or that institutions face or that these programs are having, and this is what we think we should do. Because I think it's easy to criticize, very easy. But to actually get to the root of the problem and to come up with a solution that works for all sides. Because I think when you're trying to be a champion for something or for a group of people, you need to come up with a solution which essentially is win-win for as many people as you can, right? And that led me to working closer with the government, and after 3 years of working for USA, the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, I ended up working in the minister's office at training colleges and universities.
And the minister at the time was John Malloy?
Yeah, so I worked for 4 different ministers. I started with Glenn Murray, and then John Malloy, and then Brad Dogood, and then Reza Maridi. And I did communications strategy for the first couple years, and then for the last little bit, I got really into the policy frameworks.
So you got a front row seat in terms of how government reacts to issues and finding those solutions that you just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really exciting to be there when we were developing the 30% off tuition program. We were working on, how do we really address the needs of students? How do we find and fix that gap in terms of post-secondary attainment that we have?
You're obviously a first-generation Ontarian to go to post-secondary education.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my father was a dentist back home, and when he came here, his credentials weren't recognized, which is a big problem for a lot of immigrants.
It's a huge problem for medical or dental or any professional.
He started all over again at Western University. My mom went to Sheridan College, as well as George Brown to do some work there, to learn some things and get some skills. So education's always been very important to us.
What was your motivation for running for leader? I'm sure this is a question that you get asked everywhere you go.
It is, and it's funny because my answer has evolved a little bit, which it shouldn't really, because it was what was the motivation at the time. But so I was very frustrated with Doug Ford, as many Liberals are, but I was beyond frustrated, and I thought, I am going to be the old lady yelling at the TV screen, or I'm going to do something. So I started by I looked at the field to see who was running, and I felt there was a hole in the slate. I felt like if the message in 2018 was we need a new voice, the past government stopped listening to us, if it was really a rejection of the way that government was run, a lot of the people on the slate are from that government. Everybody on the slate ran in the last election. And I thought we are not providing the Liberal alternative that I think voters are going to be looking for in 2022. So I did wait. Obviously I waited. I came in pretty late, but I'd started thinking about it in the fall. I had sort of a professional obligation that made it challenging for me to jump in. But I wondered if somebody else was going to come in, and I was watching, and if somebody who filled that need stepped up, I may not have. But I felt there was a gaping hole, somebody from the private sector, somebody who is not part of the Queen's Park elite that might have been what was rejected in the last election. And so I thought, well, if not me, who? And so here I am.
Why do you want to be leader of the Ontario Liberal Party?
It's interesting because this answer evolves. It's 4 months ago it was a bit different than it is today, but I've traveled all across Ontario. I've been to James Bay, to Espanola, to Tecumseh, everywhere in this province. And the one thing I've noticed about Ontario is that there's so much opportunity that's out there. And I feel like we're losing that opportunity. There's so much opportunity loss. If it's a young Indigenous woman, Northern Ontario, that, aspires to be a doctor and can't take the academic courses because her local high school doesn't offer them, which I was just shocked to find out that actually happens on some reserves where they just don't even offer academic stream. To me, that's a tragedy that young person has to leave their house in grade 9, grade 10, go to a place like Thunder Bay and study and live with strangers, or a farmer that wants to automate his production but can't even connect to the internet, or a young man who lives in rural Ontario, loves his town, loves his township, and has to leave it in order to get a job in the big city. These are huge opportunities that are lost in Ontario. There's some really simple examples that we all know about. The fact that if you're a doctor in Ontario, foreign trained, and you come to Ontario, there's only a 7% chance you can actually be a doctor. To me, those statistics are horrible. So when it comes to our intellectual property, when it comes to even direct foreign investment, when it comes to data collection, privacy issues, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to natural resources, I can go on and on and on. There's so much lost opportunity out there, and it's time, I think, that we had a party that recognized where the opportunity is, and actually capitalized on that opportunity in order to move Ontario forward. There is a big opportunity for us to rebuild the trust of Ontarians by developing policies that are actually reflective of where they are today and where they want to go, and to bring them along in the development of that type of policy.
Why would you want to be leader of this party?
I said right off the top, it's 31 years that I've been active in the party, and that time has given me, whether it was serving as a riding president, provincially or federally, a campus club president at U of T many years ago, a member of our central executive committee, obviously ultimately a candidate, MPP and minister. When Liberals are focused on the people that we are honored to represent, we deliver some pretty remarkable progress. When we are fiscally responsible and remember at all times that people work hard for the money they earn, but they also want to see progress, they want to see progressive policies, we can accomplish remarkable things. In all of my touring for the last year, more than 140 communities, I have yet to meet a single Ontarian who tells me they wish we were burning coal once again to produce our electricity, or they wish that we had gotten rid of full-day kindergarten, or they wish that we didn't have a green belt. These are all the kinds of progress-oriented policies that not only we ran on, not only we embraced, but we actually delivered. So I think that liberalism is a hopeful and optimistic political philosophy at its core. And I think the people of Ontario are hopeful and optimistic, and there's a good alignment there. And so I believe with my skills and my experience and my work ethic, I am strongly positioned to hit the ground running immediately after the convention in March, work harder than we've ever worked before, than I've ever worked before, relentlessly, so that we're ready for an election campaign. I call it the fight of our lives. I truly believe that, because the only thing standing between where we are today as a province and where we want to be on public education, public health care, the environment and climate change, and the right kind of prosperous and also fair economy, there's only one obstacle, and his name is Doug Ford. And so we have to be ready for that fight. We have to beat him, and we have to find a way to get our province back on track.
What led you to become a Liberal candidate and now aspire to become the next leader and future premier of this province?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with running in 2018 as a candidate. So as I said, I'd spent a decade working as a public servant, as a director at the City of London, and there were a couple of files that I'd been working on for a long time that I would go to the wall on. Mm-hmm. So one was about mental health funding. I've had way too many personal friends and contacts who have struggled with crippling addictions. Mm-hmm. I live in a neighborhood where I see people struggling with addictions every day. And we were pushing for things like supervised consumption services, which we know save lives, and we needed support from the province. The second thing was about transportation. So London is the largest city in the country without a rapid transit system. For me, investing in transit, it's not only a good economic move, but it's also, in the age of climate change, it's one of the most significant things that we can do to prevent, greenhouse gas emissions. For a lot of families who can't afford a vehicle, it's a big affordability and equity investment as well. So for me, transit is a winner on all fronts. And I wanted to see the kind of investment in London's transit system that other cities were seeing across the province. And so my MPP at the time, Deb Matthews, she announced that she wasn't running again, and she asked me to run. And like a lot of women, immediately I said, no. I have a great job that I love, and I think I'm probably better served behind the scenes. I'm finding a lot of value in what I'm doing. And she really pushed me on that, and she said, you say that you care about these things, but if you do, you need to ask yourself, what are you willing to do? And, both of those issues, as well as many others that I care about, they come down to a question of political will. And so for me, it was a question that didn't sit easy. And the more I thought about it, the more I knew there's nothing I wouldn't do to be able to see those two issues and others advanced in my community. So I left my job and I ran. And as I said in the start, it was a really tough election, right? People were very angry. The Southwest is now the toughest part of the province for Liberals to win in. We've slowly lost every seat. I ran in the last Liberal seat and lost. And people were really clear about the things that they want to see change. And so roll the clock forward, about a year after the election, the leadership race kicks off. And I just wasn't seeing in the race the kind of ideas and change that I know people are looking for from the party. And so once again, it came to a question of, what are you willing to do? And I want to know that I've done everything I possibly can to make the changes I want to see in the province. And so I'm running.
So let's pivot and talk about your broader plans as to be a Liberal leader.
When you think about our world, our province, there's uncertainty there. There's a changing economy, there's automation, AI, robotics, a lot of disruption. 40% of the jobs that we have today in our economy will not be there in 10 years. Just automation and artificial intelligence will take over. What does that mean for Ontario? How do we prepare for that future? And certainly, everything we've talked about in education is to prepare us for that future. Because these young people will, in fact, create the future that we're imagining. They will be the skilled and the talented individuals that will solve our most difficult challenges and create our biggest opportunities. And so we've got to make sure that our post-secondary education system is also going to be adapting to the needs that are changing. Micro-credentials, upskilling, reskilling, all of those things we have to be prepared for to make sure that our population is thriving in that future.
So let me go down a little further. You talked about the fact that there's going to be a change in terms of the economy, in terms of the types of jobs that are going to be out there. But Ontario historically has been the manufacturing center of Canada. And with a lot of that manufacturing jobs disappearing, we've seen what's happened in the auto sector. We've seen what's happened in a number of others. Where do you see Ontario's economy going, and how are we going to get to where you want to see us?
I was very disappointed when GM announced that it was closing Oshawa, and the Premier Ford just threw up his hands. He said the ship has sailed. That's not the type of leadership that I would expect. I expect leaders to lead, and when times are difficult or there's a change, that's when you actually come forward with new ideas. And so my vision for the is actually to create, and this is something that I announced, a ministry for technology, advanced manufacturing, and automotive. Because I believe that the future for automotive is actually embedded in research and development and in technology. And it is something that Ontario is well positioned to have a leadership role, not only in Canada and North America, but globally. And I would like to see in 2023, a year after I win the 2022 election, should I win the leadership of the party, a summit, a global summit that invites all of the leading auto producers around the world, the top 20 producers nationally, to come forward and convene in Ontario, in Southwest Ontario, in fact, the heartland of our manufacturing and our industrial base, and to talk about what is the future for this industry. How does it lead the green revolution that is needed? And whether that's in electric vehicles or in other forms of technology that is adapted, that can drive us forward. Convene that here in Ontario and let us lead that conversation. Let us figure out where this industry is going and help to create that reality.
How do you see your role as the future leader rebuilding the party?
We need to do better as an opposition to demonstrate what we would do instead, right? We need to demonstrate to the rest of Ontario that we've listened, we've learned from our mistakes of the past, we understand how not to repeat them, and that we're going to give reasons for them to vote for us. So we talk a lot about voter turnout in elections, and obviously seniors vote quite a bit, and the older you get, the more you vote. But we have an opportunity right now with people under 40 who are now the largest voting bloc. They outnumber the boomers. Millennials outnumber boomers right now, and will continue to into the future. They haven't fully formed their political ideology yet. They know what they believe in terms of their values. Generally speaking, they are much more concerned about climate change than previous generations were. Generally speaking, they are more invested in education because they have more education than any previous generation before them, but they also have more student debt. And generally speaking, they're concerned about the future economy because they understand how quickly things are happening. So we need to give them a reason to vote for us. And it needs to be more than the traditional political reasons that we've been giving people. Oh, we're the centrist party, we're going to be the most reasonable, this, that, and the other thing. We need to show them that we're listening to what they've been saying and that the polls are saying 75% of Canadians support a basic income. 71% of Ontarians support merging the Catholic and non-Catholic school boards. We think this is the third rail. It's not. It's where people believe that we should be. So we need a leader, and we need to be a party that is willing to take bold positions like that will give people a reason to vote for us. And I think I represent that. I think I represent the desire for younger people in this province to take some responsibility now over what's happening, because they've seen it happen to them for so long. And it's up to us to finally step up and say, that's no longer acceptable. I'm going to do something about that.
For one of the things that I think all of the candidates believe is that the nomination process has to happen swiftly after leadership. Some of us are more aggressive on that than others, but certainly within the year. I think 6 months, somebody said 6 months, I think that's very aggressive, but let's say within a year. That's not a lot of lag time to have a lot of slippage. So if we are immediately engaging the associations to start looking for candidates, to start hyping candidates. I mean, we have 30% of the associations that have to be properly constituted. So let's do that. But then let's start the energy around getting our 110 or 115 new candidates ready to go. And that process, over the next year will create some buzz. I'm sure of it. I'm also interested in having 3 policy conventions in each region before the next election. And if I were a leader, I would be chairing those, because I think that the membership has demonstrated that they are starved to talk about policy. It's been very exciting. We've had some regional meetings recently where people are very energized. We send, and if you're listening to this and you're a member, I'm sorry, but we send a lot of emails. Over this leadership process. Your inboxes are full. But I get a lot of answers to those emails with ideas. Let's harness those. So if people actually feel that they have an outlet and they are going to be listened to, and some of those things are going to make it into a platform, that'll keep people engaged.
I've visited probably 70 different ridings over the last couple of months. I'm gonna keep going and meeting people. I'm in Durham tonight. On the weekend, I went to 5 or 6 cities, small towns. I'm going to keep going out there talking to Liberals, listening to Liberals, listening to Ontarians, collecting ideas, bringing people together, and looking for an alternative to Doug Ford. And I think that if we work hard, if we're authentic, if we're real, we can actually do something special here in Ontario.
I started campaigning just about a year ago. I have been working at this essentially full-time for a year. I have traveled a lot. I've toured a lot. I have not taken many days off in the course of the year. In fact, over the Christmas holidays, I had a bit of a break and I managed to get bronchitis. So that just goes to show when your system's feeling a little bit vulnerable, I guess things like that take over. Look, I am greatly encouraged by the success that we've had so far in the campaign. I am blessed to be surrounded by an extraordinary team of campaign workers and volunteers from all over the province. They are an exciting group to work with. We have brought in nearly 15,000 new members to the party, which is a huge number, far exceeding my original goal from months ago. I mentioned earlier we've raised the most money for our campaign, now north of $400,000, and we will have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 people running to be delegates for me across the province. All of that is encouraging. I've been around the business long enough to know until the votes were actually cast and in the ballot boxes and counted, nothing else matters. But I also know equally there are no shortcuts to success in life, that it really does just boil down to hard work and being relentless. And I will continue to work hard. I will continue to work hard throughout this leadership process. Let me also say the other 5 candidates, all of whom entered the race at different times, are all working really hard too. And so are their teams. And I've seen slates of leadership candidates going back many, many years, as we talked about. It's a great slate of candidates running for leader of our party right now. We are blessed to have a really good mix, 3 women, 3 men, different perspectives, different ideas. If I win the leadership, absolutely I'm going to keep working as hard as I can to beat Doug Ford and get Ontario back on track. And if I don't win the leadership, I'll be doing the exact same thing. I'll be proud to serve under any one of the other 5 if they become leader, and I will do whatever I can to help them and help our party, because Doug Ford has to go, and only Ontario Liberals can make that happen.
So after the last election, I led something called the Listening Project, where it was mostly a group of new candidates, some experienced politicians, and we reached out to every candidate who ran for the party across the province and asked them to sit down for an interview, ask them how they're doing and thank them for running and so on, but then also say, what do you think happened? What would it take to be able to win back the support of people in your riding? And we produced a report, I think it's 30 or 35 pages, that articulated exactly what people feel that we need to do. And so the number one recommendation out of that report, which was also very true to my experience in London North Centre, is we need to show people that we understand what matters to them and that we are the party that is pushing the ideas and policies that will improve their quality of life and well-being, full stop. And I think for most people, they care less about, which party. They're not diehard Liberal, NDP, Conservative, etc. Each election is its own event, and they look at, who is promoting policies that I think that would help me, help my family, help my community. So we need to be better in touch with the things that matter to people across Ontario, appreciating that it is different depending on where you are. And as a party, we need to be able to articulate those priorities very, very clearly going into the next election.
like I've always done, I've been a leader, I've been a CEO, and have the background in the education where making sure our party is almost very similar to a small and business, really, in terms of its operations, the size of its operations, and the need to fundraise for campaigns. And we're going to do that by growing the base of the party. I championed openness and fairness in our party with one member, one vote. And one of the reasons I did that is that I actually believe we need to grow the base of our party. We need to be that great big red tent that people feel that they belong. People from all sides of the political spectrum can find a place in the Ontario Liberal Party to represent the things that they value and that they want to see happen under a progressive Liberal government. And so from that base, we will raise the money that we need for our party. We have to become more modern. We have to become younger as a party. I truly believe that, and welcome people in, bring people in, and of course they will invest in the party and contribute to the party through their local ridings, through their local communities, and our party will be healthy and thriving under Mitzi Hunter leadership.
We need people to be engaged and involved in politics. And I think giving them things to be excited about are reasons for them to donate and to support the party. But more importantly, we need to be much better organized. We need to be digital first because we are far, far behind the other parties in terms of having that database and having that access to people. Early in our campaign, we had a very strong online presence where we had an ad campaign on social media. We reached a unique audience of 685,000 Ontarians, which is almost 2/3 of everyone who voted for the Ontario Liberal Party in the last election. Having that audience is key. Being able to interact with them and identify them and further expand our knowledge of where they live and who they are, and so we can call them for donations, put up signs, become volunteers, all that. What do we need to do as a party? That's our feedback loop. We have to change the culture. We have to make sure that we're always engaged on every platform and every social media platform that's around, because in 2018, we were not. There were gaps between the 2014 and the 2018 election that I spoke with Michael Chan with a lot about how on WeChat and Chinese social media, they were talking about the most vile things about Premier Wynne, and we let it slide because we didn't think it was dignified to respond to it, and we didn't need to, and that we could address it when the election came around. That's not true. We lost that support because we weren't engaging in those conversations. So we need to have that presence digitally. I think 40 or 50% of Ontarians now get their news primarily through social media. And we need to give them the avenue through those mediums to support the party, become a member of the party, fundraise, and donate to the party, right? Mm-hmm. It's all about expanding the pool. So instead of taxing the 40,000 members that we have, which always goes down to 10 to 15 in between elections, let's have a larger pool of hundreds of thousands of people that we can talk to.